This Workforce Wellness webinar series wouldn't be possible without the partnership of Centerstone, and so again, we are grateful for that, as well as the sponsorship of All Trust. All Trust Insurance jumped on before we even launched the series to say that they supported the importance of workforce wellness and wanted to be part of this series. So with that, I would like to introduce you to Terry Allen, the Trauma Services Manager at Centerstone. Terry is a licensed mental health counselor and trauma services manager. She has more than 20 years of experience working with children and families who experience child abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect. She's provided therapeutic services to assault victims for more than 2 decades. She also maintains strong community involvement, including countless opportunities to speak and offer training on trauma-related issues to community organizations and businesses. She participates at the national level and the state level in a number of organizations that support this critical work that is happening in our communities. Again, we are so thankful that you are joining us to hear from Terry. Terry, I am now going to mute myself. If you can unmute yourself, we will turn the PowerPoint and the presentation over to you. Thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. So I'm presenting on the ABCs of trauma-informed, having a trauma-informed workplace. And this is a project that's been funded by SAMHSA grant, a SAMHSA grant that we have through Centerstone, and in which we provide training, as well as some therapeutic services. So some of the things that we're going to focus on today are very important during this time of going through all the current crisis that the whole world is experiencing right now with the pandemic and then the civil unrest and now we have in our areas, we're planning for hurricane season. So there's natural disasters and things that we're all encountering that are above and beyond what we usually encounter. So our learning objectives are to be able to define trauma, recognize trauma, and vicarious trauma, recognize how to determine if an employee is experiencing a traumatic reaction, and then to learn some simple grounding techniques that will be able to be useful in our work. So the first thing we need to do is identify what trauma is. We all are presented with traumatic events throughout our entire lives, but in order to define if something is traumatizing to a person, a trauma is a distressful or disturbing experience that's perceived as a threat to safety or well-being, and it creates significant and lasting damage, mentally, physically, and emotionally. So there's different types of trauma, and in our list, we, in preparing for this presentation, we've even had to add pandemics. We've never had pandemics added to this list since we've started training on being trauma-informed. But some of the types of trauma that occur: homelessness, car accidents, chronic illness of family members, physical abuse, disasters, system trauma, abuse. They're all, there's something that trauma, none of us are immune to being faced with traumatic events. In order to understand trauma, trauma events, there's 2 different types of trauma. There's complex event trauma, and there's also single event trauma. Single event trauma, I think almost all of us can relate to. For example, if we have a car accident, or most everybody's been in a car accident or witnessed a car accident, or so a single event trauma is, there are consequences of that. It may be injury, there may be financial consequences with that. The thing is, a single event trauma, we can trace it back to one trauma, and then we deal with the consequences from there. Complex event trauma is something that during COVID-19 that we're all experiencing right now. Complex trauma is traumas within traumas. So we're all experiencing the trauma of the world in a pandemic. But within that trauma, there are people who have other events that may be triggered due to the stress they're perceiving right now. For example, there may be domestic violence. We know that violence can increase with social isolation. So some of our families in our community might be experiencing some domestic violence. Within domestic violence, some of the responses of family members in a domestic violence situation may turn to substance use, which then creates another trauma that can lead to other consequences such as family separation, loss, legal problems. And so we have trauma within a trauma being triggered by other traumas. And so that's what makes it even more complex, which means we would see more symptoms being triggered by an individual that has a history of maybe more trauma. So that leads us to talking about the possible responses to trauma. It's really important for us to look at trauma as a biological response. So we're going to talk about the brain and some of the chemical reactions that happen when we are faced with a trauma and how that leads to fight, flight, or freeze. So in talking about the brain, I'm going to talk about the bottom. I'm going to go from bottom to top on this slide. It's first important to notice that the prefrontal cortex, that's that social emotional control center, the rational part of our brain. In us as humans, we're able to rationalize, to think before we act, those kinds of things. Well, in a crisis, what happens is the amygdala sends a message to the hippocampus to prepare for danger. And that's the primitive part of the brain. That's kind of, sometimes it looks like animal instinct, where we don't have control over what how we're responding. The rational part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex is shut off, and then the hippocampus releases the stress hormones that lead us to a flight, fight, or freeze response. I think most of us who've made it through high school and have had biology classes, we've learned about fight, flight, or freeze. We know that if we come across a baby bear and there's a mama bear want to protect it, that mama bear is just going to fight to protect. That's that animalistic instinct, and that animals don't have rational thought. They're not thinking, oh, I wonder what will happen if I go ahead and attack this human. Instead, there isn't that rational thing, there's just a reaction. Well, that's what happens in us humans when we are faced with a crisis. The rational emotional side is shut off, and we are just reacting for survival. So to look at fight, flight, or freeze a little more closely, we can think of some examples of where we may see this. The fight response is you'll notice somebody is concerned about preservation at all costs. You might notice individuals with explosive temper or outbursts, or they're aggressive, or they appear angry in all their responses. There might be an attempt at controlling others. It seems like the person's not hearing another person's point of view. And so really demanding perfection, dictating how things happen. A lot of times these get mislabeled as disorders when actually it is just a crisis response. It's a symptom of somebody feeling threatened. And so sometimes they are mislabeled as conduct disorder or seeing somebody as narcissistic or a sociopath, when actually they are just feeling threatened because of the amount of crisis or trauma that they've experienced. So that leads us to flight, just like this little fella. So flight is, just taking off. It's hit with feelings of panic or anxiety. It can look like rushing around, over worrying. The this little fella just dropped his lunch and ran. There's no thinking like, am I going to need that later? It is just survival instinct to take off and get out, get away. And so sometimes those are mislabeled as OCD, bipolar, ADHD, panic disorder, mood disorder. But at this time, it's important to be looking at our colleagues and the people around us and our family members, and always be asking ourselves, could this be a crisis response? Is this a trigger to some of the feelings, the lack of safety that we're all feeling? And then the freeze response, kind of, sometimes people get accused of being a couch potato. And so that's, sometimes that's what it looks like. It looks like somebody spacing out, somebody who just wants to sleep all the time or avoiding any contact. It could be dissociating. It could be just kind of feeling like the person feels they're in a brain fog, difficulty making or acting on decisions. And sometimes people might explain it as feeling dead or lifeless, feeling numb. I hear a lot from people. And so it's important that we don't try to label that as like, oh, this person now has a clinical depression or ADD or schizophrenia. It's very common right now during all that we're experiencing in the world, that we're seeing trauma triggers at this time. And so the freeze could be one of those. So that brings us to an activity to kind of practice recognizing, are the people around me experiencing fight, flight, or freeze? So what I'd like everybody to do is please answer this. There's 5 scenarios. The first one, employee keeps sending back work for corrections, even though the corrections have no real impact on the outcome. Please choose whether it's fight, flight, or freeze. The second scenario is the employee storms out of a room when asked to explain the situation at hand. Do you think that's fight, flight, or freeze? The third one is the employee rushes around, always fixing the work of others. Another example that we can see in different situations is maybe an employee who's been avoiding all meetings and conversations with their coworkers. Just kind of seems like they're hibernating at their desk. Sometimes it looks like they're just focused on their phones. And then the 5th scenario, the employee does not give verbal responses and appears to be daydreaming during meetings. If you could answer this and submit your answers, then we'll go over what each scenario is. I think we're still waiting for the polls to come in. Okay, so we have a mixture of answers. So scenario number 1, let's say we have an employee that keeps sending back work for corrections, even though the corrections have no real impact on the outcomes. The answer to that is, there's actually 2 possible answers. It could be fight or flight. And that really goes to show us that we don't have control over which way our body reacts. So it could be fight. We could have the instinct to just fight, or it could be that it is a kind of a way to avoid by just keep sending things back. Scenario 2, the employee storms out of the room when asked to explain the situation at hand. So that one's kind of a little more obvious. That is flight. The storming, though, if the storming was like with pounding and to make a statement that was threatening looking, it may have had some fight with it. So I'm not going to say the people who picked fight were totally wrong. There is, it could be one or the other. I'm going to go to the employee rushes around, always fixing the work of others. Was flight. It could be fight if it is like threatening, but that flight, that rushing around, trying to, keeping themselves distracted. That's where we see that busyness, wanting to keep busy. That's a signal that it's a flight response. Employees been avoiding all meetings and conversations with coworkers. So that would be, that is freeze. Conscious avoidance could be a little bit of flight too. So you see there is, sometimes we can tell if it's fight or flight or freeze, whether or not it is a trauma reaction. The employee does not give verbal responses and appears to be daydreaming during meetings. And that is freeze. That's, unless it could be a little bit of flight avoidance, but that daydreaming, remember the dissociation of our couch potato, looking like they're not participating. So I'm going to close that now. And that leads us to talking about cumulative factors which can threaten our employees' mental health. During the pandemic, we are all faced with the possibility of having anxiety about getting sick or job or wage loss, whether it's real or threatened, the way we see the economy, or the loneliness due to critical public health measures. We are all facing that. And then there's the other side of this, another factor is whether or not we ourselves or the people around us have past trauma or mental health issues. And so it's important to keep in mind that we are all bringing something that could be crisis response, and then there could be even more triggers from that we might be seeing in some of our colleagues, where they are handling the situation differently than some of the other. Oops. Guess I have to, there we go. So then it's important for us to look at, what are some of these other possible traumas that our colleagues, our family members, other people in society, in our community, what are they dealing with? And so, if we look at the statistics between 2015 and 2017, heroin-related deaths were on a decline, while fentanyl and cocaine deaths were among the highest in the state of Florida. So even though the numbers were starting to drop, Manatee County was still number 3 in the state for removals in 2018. And so what that means is there are many, many people around us who are impacted with those high numbers of maybe experiencing death of a loved one, homelessness that comes with substance use, the other issues related to substance use, issues of abandonment, co-occurring mental illness. And then in the 12th Judicial District, which is comprised of Manatee, Sarasota, and DeSoto counties, we have been consistently above the statewide average when it comes to children who are removed from their homes and placed in outside care. So with that, we all have the possibility of having people around us who, in our workspaces, who are experiencing family separation and trauma on top of the pandemic, child neglect, domestic violence, child abuse and sexual abuse, and child welfare system trauma. Just getting any type of system interaction can feel like a threat and be a trauma in itself. And during this pandemic, the suspected overdose submissions to the Office of National Drug Control Policy's overdose data mapping program from January to April this year were up 16.6%. And that's versus the same period of time in 2019. So we are seeing that this is continuing, that substance use is being triggered, whether or not people have past traumas or past mental health co-occurring conditions are being triggered at this time of worldwide crisis. So that leads us to the ABCs of having a trauma-informed workplaces. We created the ABCs to help us have a mnemonic, sorry for my pronunciation, device so that we can have easy recall to help us recognize what somebody may be experiencing. So the ABCs with our coworkers, the A stands for acknowledge. What we want to do is acknowledge that your coworker, that pretty much whoever's in the grocery store with us, wherever we are, people around us have experienced some form of trauma. And so it's important for us to acknowledge that. When we look at the statistics in our community and across the world, it's really, it really tells us a lot. We can't, and now experiencing a pandemic, we are all experiencing this crisis in some way. So it's important for us to acknowledge that people are also bringing other forms of trauma with them that might be triggering some old reactions in the brain, some reactions where our brain is perceiving a threat, which remember leads to fight, flight, or freeze responses. And so that leads us to the B. In order to deal with the fight, flight, or freeze responses, we have to be the calm. And so sometimes that's filtering the toxic air, not joining in. If we see somebody having a reaction that's a flight response, to not go into panic mode with that person, but instead stay calm. If somebody seems like they're giving us a threatening response, a fight response, we want to remind ourselves this could be a trauma reaction. Is this fight, flight, or freeze? And we want to be the calm. If we keep our heart rate calm, then people around us will mirror us, and they will also be able to calm and be grounded. And so that brings us to C, collaborate. We want to collaborate with the individual to best meet their needs. So instead of taking it as a threat when somebody is having a trauma trigger, and we are seeing a lot of trauma triggers right now, we're seeing a lot of reactions that just don't seem rational, and where people might be arguing, they might just be running, people might be disconnected. And so it's important for us to collaborate with the individual to help them to meet their needs. So, and right now we are all trauma responders because we are all working around people and with people who have experienced some type of trauma. And so with that, we need to also be concerned about vicarious trauma. So the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. This quote is so descriptive that we can't expect that we're not going to be impacted by all that the world is experiencing right now. And so it's important for us to recognize that, and so that then we can take action with that. Defining what vicarious trauma is, it is when a person's exposed to or preoccupied with the trauma of the people he or she serves. And right now that's in all of our workplaces. We have people coming into work with us or working remotely. They've been concerned about childcare. They might have had illness. They might have wage loss. All that somebody else is experiencing is bringing to the table with us, and that can impact us as well as we watch. If we watch the news media or too much trauma over and over again, that can be triggering for us, and that's where vicarious trauma can come in. So, and then increased trauma triggers due to the pandemic are important for us to acknowledge. During COVID-19, everyone is in a low-level state of fight or flight all the time. And what that means is our body has nowhere to flee. It has nothing to fight. And so that gets exhausting. So we may see, people are talking about Zoom exhaustion. We may see people who just feel like they're not getting enough sleep, people who aren't sitting still and maybe never sleeping. We're seeing all that in our workplace, and I am sure that other workplaces are as well. So what we have to keep in mind is now, how do we deal with that? If we know that we are in this state of fight or flight, we have to do something with that energy that we don't really, it's a natural reaction. So effective coping will provide for moments of resting the mind so that we can avoid freezing, that numbing. We want to make sure that people are avoiding numbing through ways of alcohol use or destructive ways that are maybe ways that are, depressive symptoms that are keeping them from getting out of bed or hiding out and not being able to get to work or function. And so it's important for us to provide resting moments for the mind. We have to create those resting moments. That way we don't end up with freeze when we can't fight or flight. So some simple grounding techniques that can help in this is offering a drink of water. Anything that incorporates the 5 senses, things we see, hear, touch, smell, and taste. So anytime you're thinking about like, how can I get myself or my colleague or my employee, how can I assist them in getting grounded and in getting more in that rational part of their brain if they are triggered, is any of these techniques that, maybe offering a cold drink of water, maybe going for a walk, get out in the sun, offer to take their hand and hey, let's go to the next room. We have social distancing, so maybe don't take their hand, but to be able to move around, laugh, play catch, be playful, draw pictures, take notes, create absorbing activities, writing down some action plans. That will take us to that gives us a purpose. It keeps us focused in the present without being focused on the crisis at hand. Helps a person feel more in control. So one example of this that I saw with our staff, our CEO here at Centerstone in Florida, Melissa, she met with my staff on a meeting and said, what are you guys doing for self-care? And so actually created a project for us to how about we create a project and submit it to her on some self-care activities. And so it gave my staff a purpose. They all got involved. And that was an example of creating absorbing activities. giving them some tasks to do that help feel like there's some resolution. And so some other things, numbing versus mindful numbing, like taking opportunity to have mindful numbing, to take that time to maybe close your eyes and meditate, or so that you're purposefully taking that time to numb so that you're not spacing out, maybe during a meeting or when you're trying to work. So for our next activity then, I just wanted to offer a poll, just so that we can kind of get a feel for what kinds of things is our participants. What kinds of things are you finding useful or have you discovered? And please, if you check any other, please feel free to chat them in, because information sharing is so important at this time. It helps us. We are all kind of going through, there's some similarities of what we're all going through in this pandemic. And then when we look at the history, we all are impacted in different ways. It is important for us to share how we can be effective at grounding and what our preferences are. So hopefully everybody is finding where they can submit once they chose their top 3 grounding preferences. You are able to multi-select. Okay, looks like the poll came in. Thank you everybody for participating. So you can see we have a big variety. Speaking with a friend or colleague, talking is a big one. As human beings, it is very important for us to be able to communicate what we're experiencing. And that can be hard during a time of social distancing, and when people have to be isolated. And so trying to figure out ways, how can I speak about what I'm experiencing, and who is safe to speak to about that? It's really important in our workplaces to be a safe person, to be able to hear what the person's experiencing without feeling threatened, because that will assist in recovering or staying grounded, getting back to some more clear thinking. And we have sing or listen to your favorite song. Music is a big one. Going outside. I'm hearing from colleagues across the nation that getting outside is like a big one. Having that sunshine on our face, especially when we're so much in this technology world right now. It's really important to connect with nature. So you can see we have a little bit of everything. Nobody wants to do 10 jumping jacks. But that is also anything you could do to engage the heart rate, especially if somebody is experiencing panic. And that's why jumping jacks is in there, because that gets us grounded, and we are purposefully pumping up our heart rate. We are taking charge of doing that, rather than our brain just taking over with that crisis response. So hopefully that makes sense. So There are positive responses to vicarious trauma. And if there weren't positive responses to vicarious trauma, I wouldn't be able to work in the trauma field for so many years. And that's compassion, satisfaction, self-fulfillment. So, you know, even being able to assist your coworker or your employee in getting through a time of crisis, a fight, flight, or freeze response, it can feel satisfying, and it works for the better of our whole business world. Vicarious resilience and transformation through helping somebody else. Sometimes that helps to transform ourselves. Some of the negative responses that we want to be careful about is that compassion fatigue, that just feeling exhausted, where we just end up not able to even respond or deal with any of the stressors that we're facing. And secondary traumatic stress. We want to make sure that we aren't being traumatized by the people we're trying to assist. And so be on the lookout for trauma symptoms, which might be that hypervigilance, flashbacks, anything that might trigger a need for some intervention beyond some of these things that we've been talking about, where maybe we need to seek out some professional counseling, therapeutic intervention. And so it can start to look like this if we're dealing with that burnout, compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress. We just need to be wound back up. And so sometimes we do need to seek out some professional help. And that is okay. That's because the stress, and that's one of the things I keep hearing the most in all of my my work groups that I'm in, is reminding yourself that it's okay. It's okay that we're reacting with maybe a fight, flight, or freeze response, and that we can recognize why, and then how to move on from there, and how to be productive from that point. And if it is to the point where now we're experiencing nightmares or symptoms that just are making it difficult to function, it is okay to seek out professional help. But the main thing is seek out your peers, seek out your coworkers, your colleagues, family, and engage in those self-care, some of those grounding techniques. Maybe create those for yourself before you need them in the moment, is self-care. And so these are our locations that we have for child trauma services, but Centerstone also has, but the grant that SAMHSA has funded that allows these trainings, allows us to provide intervention for children and their families who are experiencing trauma, as well as these trainings, the ABCs of Trauma-Informed Services. We try to apply it to the audiences that we're working with. And the youth mental health first aid trainings are also available through this department. And here is some numbers so that you can reach out to Centerstone if that professional assistance is something that you're feeling like you need to maybe reach out for yourself, or to refer someone you care about and work with. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Terry. And now what we will do, I've noticed that several of you have logged in questions either through the Q&A feature here in Zoom or through the chat. So Terry, if you've got a few extra minutes, I'll go ahead and facilitate the questions that have been submitted by attendees. The first is that recognizing that you've covered ways to recognize trauma and how to respond appropriately, and it's been great information for all of us. Do you have recommendations on how to have a conversation or start a conversation with an employee in whom you're seeing the signs of this type of trauma through their behavior? how can you bring that up in a way that's appropriate? And then what are your recommendations on how to suggest in a non-threatening way that they get professional assistance?
Yeah, it is. It, where we work, we have team meetings, and so we acknowledge a lot, just acknowledging that we're all going through different types of trauma and that we all have different reactions. And so, the first step is just to ask, are you doing okay? How are you dealing with everything? And be that listening ear. And if we are, and then you can provide some of this information if it seems like the person needs more information. But that's usually just taking, just to be genuine in your concern and to ask, how are you doing with everything? And sometimes using a bit of self-disclosure that, I notice this is happening for me right now. How is it going for you? Sometimes that can be helpful, but we want to be careful that we're not saying somebody should be exactly like us.
And I think the second part of that question on how to suggest professional assistance, there's been so much conversation globally really around reducing the stigma of mental health assistance. And so any thoughts on language that we can use on suggesting that someone consider professional assistance?
Yeah. So sometimes just saying, there are resources available. There is, people do have a stigma about mental health at times, but sometimes people calling it counseling or getting, having some therapy. Our care, we have our care line, sometimes offering online access or platforms or phone calls where a person can call anonymously or confidentially can be very helpful, because then once they reach out to that line, then they can get it, they can be validated. It normalizes a lot of times, like, yeah, what you're experiencing makes sense. Being able to get that message is very validating, and that can empower them to go a step further.
So with that, thank you to Centerstone, thank you to All Trust Insurance, and thank you to all of you that have been on today's webinar and are committed to ensuring that there is a positive and healthy environment for supporting the wellness of your workforce. Have a great afternoon, and I hope to see you in person or at least on Zoom sometime soon. Thank you.